Welcome to Wandering Lotus Audio. Before we begin today's story, take a moment to set aside whatever is weighing on your mind. Breathe in slowly, breathe out gently, and let your thoughts settle like water returning to stillness after a stone has passed through. There is a quiet place inside you that has always been there, waiting. Today, we visit it together. This is a story about karma, about the quiet strength of a good heart, and about the most important lesson the Buddha ever taught, a lesson many people have heard, but few have truly lived. It is simply this: what others do is their own path. Guard your heart. Peace will find you on its own. We begin in a small village beside a slow-moving river, in a time not very different from our own. The village of Chuklan sat nestled along the banks of a gentle river, where the water ran clear year-round and bamboo groves lined the shore like quiet sentinels. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, their names, their histories, their struggles. And as happens in places like that, the closeness that bound people together could sometimes curdle into envy, suspicion, and the slow poison of gossip. At the far end of the village, near the river's bend, lived a small family in a simple thatched house, kept clean and orderly despite its modesty. The father, Bin, was a gentleman who had never raised his voice in anger toward another soul. The mother, Hung, was quietly strong, tireless in her care for the family, despite her fragile health. And their only son, born with great hope, was given the name Thien, a name that meant goodness, chosen before he drew his first breath, because his father wished for him a life unweighted by hatred or bitterness. Thien grew up surrounded by the smell of rice fields after rain, the sound of the river at night, and the steady love of two good parents. But life does not grant any of us a path without shadow. When Thien was 14, his father collapsed after a long harvest season, worked through cold and rain. The illness moved quickly. Within 3 months, the gentleman was gone, leaving behind a sick wife, a grieving boy, and debts to half the village from borrowed medicine money. For Thien, it was as though the sun had simply switched off in the middle of the day. He became quiet, then withdrawn, then angry, a deep, directionless anger that had no single target because its real source was grief he did not know how to carry. He resented the neighbors who looked at his mother with pitying eyes. He resented the households with fathers still alive. He resented the sky itself for being indifferent. That resentment eventually turned outward. A classmate named Fook, careless with words the way young people sometimes are, remarked one afternoon that a boy without a father was unlikely to amount to anything. Thien did not think, he simply swung. By the time adults pulled them apart, both boys were bloodied, and Thien sat in the dirt, staring at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. His mother, worn thin by grief and worry, made a decision. She took Thien to the small monastery on the hill at the edge of the village, called Tin Tam, meaning pure heart, not only to seek ointment for his wounds, but to seek something for the wound that did not show. The monastery was modest, a few prayer halls, a quiet courtyard, and at its center an ancient Bodhi tree whose branches spread wide in every direction, as though offering shelter to anyone who approached. The monk who tended the place was Master Tam Min, a man of nearly 70, with a face etched by decades and eyes that held the particular stillness of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by the world. He was watering a plant when they arrived. He looked at Thien once, said nothing about the fight, and simply poured 2 cups of tea. Then he asked a question so simple it caught Thien off guard. "What are you carrying inside right now?" Something about the question, the way it was asked without judgment or hurry, opened something in Thien's chest.
He told the master everything: his father's death, the debts, the neighbor's words, the fight. His voice shook. He had not spoken any of it aloud before. Master Tam Min listened without interrupting, without fidgeting, without any sign of impatience. When Thien finished, the old monk rose slowly, walked to the courtyard, and pointed to the Bodhi tree. "Do you see that tree? Last night there was a strong wind. Several branches broke, leaves scattered everywhere. Tell me, did the tree chase after the wind? Did it rage at the storm for what it took?" Thien looked at the tree. "No, a tree cannot chase the wind." "And yet," the master said, returning to his seat, "the tree is still standing this morning, its roots held. Come spring, it will bloom again." He looked at Thien steadily. "People are no different. In this life, winds will come, unkind words, unfair losses, people who misjudge us without cause. We cannot prevent the wind from blowing, but we can decide where our roots go. If every wind sends us chasing after it in anger, we exhaust ourselves, and the wind does not even notice. But if we tend our roots, if we protect the goodness inside us, we remain standing no matter what comes." He paused, then spoke the words Thien would carry for the rest of his life. The Buddha taught in the Dhammapada, the mind is the forerunner of all actions. If one speaks or acts with a corrupted mind, suffering follows, as a wheel follows the hoof of an ox. But if one speaks or acts with a serene mind, happiness follows, as a shadow that never departs. Thien, the most important thing in your life is not what others say about you. It is not your circumstances. It is the condition of your own mind. Guard that, and you guard everything. Those words did not remake Thien overnight. True understanding rarely works like that. But something shifted in Thien's chest that afternoon, a tightness loosening, breath coming a little easier. He returned to the monastery a few days later, and then again. Not every visit involved formal teaching. Sometimes he simply sat beneath the Bodhi tree in silence and practiced the unfamiliar act of stillness. Over time, a boy who had been consumed by anger became a young man who could sit quietly with discomfort without being undone by it. He continued to work the fields, he continued to care for his mother, but something in the way he moved through the world had changed, quieter, more rooted, harder to knock sideways. By the time Thien was 25, he had married a kind woman named Lan, and they lived together with his aging mother in the same small house near the river. Their life was modest, but warm, the kind of warmth that does not depend on abundance. Then came the drought. That summer the rains failed across the entire region. The canals shrank, the rice paddies cracked open under a pitiless sun. Nearly every farm in Chuklam suffered heavy losses. Every farm but one. Thien's field still had water. He had spent the previous rainy season digging a small reservoir and diverting a trickle from a hillside stream, working quietly, telling no one, simply doing what seemed sensible. When the drought arrived, his preparation held, his crop survived, not abundantly, but enough. It should have been seen as diligence. Instead, it became fuel. Among people already frightened by lost harvests, Thien's green fields looked suspicious. Rumors spread quickly. He had secretly diverted water from neighboring fields in the night. He had blocked channels that should have flowed to others. There was no evidence for any of this. There could not be, because none of it was true. But fear and envy are poor editors of what they choose to believe. A neighbor named Luke, whose fields bordered Thien's and had watched his crop wither while Thien stayed green, arrived at Thien's door one evening in a barely contained fury. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, loud enough for half the street to hear. Inside, Thien's mother sat very still. His wife held their small child close. Thien stepped outside. He looked at Luke and then at the small cluster of neighbors who had gathered to watch. "I understand why you're upset," he said quietly. "Losing a harvest is frightening, but I did not take your water. What kept my fields alive is a channel I dug from the stream up on the hill last rainy season. You are welcome to come and see it tomorrow. If I am wrong, I will take responsibility. If I am not, I only ask that we understand each other honestly, because we are neighbors, and we will be neighbors for the rest of our lives." Luke, in that moment, was not interested in reason. He continued. Some of his words were unkind enough to make Thien's wife turn away. Thien said nothing more. He waited. When Luke had finished, Thien bowed slightly and went back inside. That night, after the house was quiet, his mother whispered to him, "Doesn't it hurt to stand there in..."
Years passed, as years do. Thien and Lang had a son they named Bao. His mother grew older and more frail, but spent her final years in a household full of laughter, tended with care. The small house near the river grew fuller and warmer with each season. Then a harder season came. Disease swept through the animals of the region. Livestock died. Fear spread faster than the illness itself, and frightened people, as they sometimes do, began to search for someone to blame. A rumor fastened itself to Thien's family. Their pig had fallen ill first, they had concealed it, and because of them, the entire village had suffered. None of this was true. The disease had arrived from a trading route before any animal in Truklam showed symptoms. But truth travels slowly when panic is already running. One night, a group of men, inflamed by fear and the particular recklessness of a crowd, came to Thien's house after dark. They broke apart the animal pen. They threw stones against the walls. They shouted things that woke the children and made the old woman in the back room collapse with fright. Thien's wife gathered their son and held him tightly. Thien stood in the doorway watching until the men were finished and had gone. That night, sitting alone on the porch under a full moon, Thien felt something rise in him that he had not felt since he was 14 years old. A hot, focused anger. He thought about finding the men. He thought about confronting them by name. He thought about what they had cost his family. He sat with that feeling for a long time without acting on it. In the morning, he went to the monastery. Master Tan Ming, now very old and moving slowly, listened to everything. When Thien finished, the monk said something unexpected. "Your anger is not wrong. What was done to your family was wrong. Do not bury the feeling. Buried things become poison." Thien was quiet. "But," the monk continued, "there is a difference between what you feel and what you do next. If you go to those men filled with the desire to make them suffer as you have, you will likely create more harm, and your family will live in the shadow of that conflict for years. But if you wait until you are calm and then go to the village elder, not to punish anyone, but to report what happened and ask that it not happen again, that is a different act entirely. One comes from a wounded heart striking outward. The other comes from a steady heart protecting what it loves." He looked at Thien carefully. Guarding your heart does not mean doing nothing. It means that whatever you do comes from the ground of goodness, not from the ground of revenge. That is the difference between karma that binds and karma that frees. Thien returned home, sat with his wife through the remainder of that difficult day, and helped his son sleep. Then he went to the village elder, calmly, and laid out what had happened without embellishment and without naming enemies. He asked only that the truth about the disease be established and that his family be protected. An inquiry followed. Healers came from the nearest town and confirmed what was already medically obvious.
The disease had entered the region through livestock trade weeks before any animal in the village fell sick. Thien's pig had been one of many victims, not the source. The elder announced this publicly. Some of the men who had come that night arrived at Thien's door over the following week, awkward and ashamed. He received them without drama, without a rehearsed speech about what they had done. He accepted their help in repairing the damaged pen. "Fear makes people do things they would not otherwise do," he said to one of them. "What matters now is that we know the truth and we look after each other better." Luc was among those who came. He had been in the crowd that night. He stood at the gate with a basket of fruit and could not meet Thien's eyes. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "There is too much to say, and none of it seems like enough." Thien took the basket from his hands and stepped aside to let him in. "Then let us not say it," Thien replied. "Come inside. My mother would enjoy company." They sat together that afternoon, the two men whose relationship had been a complicated tangle of misunderstanding and distance for years. They did not rehash any of it. They drank tea. They talked about the coming season, about Bao's progress in school, about Luc's ailing knee. Something that had been stiff between them went soft. In the years that followed, Luc became one of Thien's closest friends. Their children grew up together, their families helped each other at harvest time without being asked. It was the kind of friendship that feels like it always was there, waiting for the stubbornness to clear away so it could be seen. One evening, sitting on Thien's porch as they had come to do regularly, Luc said quietly, "I've been thinking about all the years I spent being suspicious of you. The water, the drought, all of it. I wasted so much time." Thien was quiet for a moment. "We both learned from it," he said finally. "How did you hold steady through all of that? I would have cracked long before." Thien looked at the river beyond the trees, moving in the late light. "I was taught something when I was young," he said. "A teacher showed me a tree after a storm and asked if the tree was angry at the wind. I've thought about that image for 50 years. I don't think I've mastered it, but I've tried to remember it, that the wind is not mine to control, and that my roots are the one thing I am always responsible for." He paused. "And honestly, carrying anger is exhausting. It's like drinking something bitter every morning because you're hoping someone else will get sick. After a while, you simply prefer the alternative." Luc laughed. A real laugh, the kind that clears the air. Master Ming, now past 90, called Thien to the monastery one final time. The old man lay propped on cushions, his body very thin, but his eyes still clear and present in the way they had always been. Thien sat beside him and took his hand. "I have watched you for 50 years, the master said, his voice slow and careful. "You were 14 when you first came here, filled with grief and anger. I have watched you face gossip, injustice, and real harm, and choose each time the harder path. Not because it was easy, but because you understood that the condition of your own mind is the one thing that is always yours." He rested for a moment. Then he continued, "Remember this. The karma that others create is theirs to carry. You do not need to chase it, punish it, or carry it for them. What you create in your own thoughts, words, and actions, that is yours, and it will follow you as faithfully as your shadow. Let what you plant be worth harvesting." He smiled and closed his eyes. Several days later, Master Ming passed from this world peacefully, as monks who have long practiced stillness sometimes do, without drama, without apparent fear, as though sleep and death were not so different from one another. Thien grew old beside the same river in the house he had always known, surrounded by grandchildren who had inherited something of his patience without quite knowing where it had come from. The village remembered him not for wealth or achievement, but for the particular quality of his presence. The way problems that seemed immovable would sometimes quietly resolve themselves when Thien was involved, not because he forced anything, but because his steadiness gave other people room to find their own way back to sense. His life, measured by ordinary standards, was a small one. A village, a family, a piece of land by a river. But the peace he carried was not small, and unlike many things that look large from the outside, it did not diminish with time or circumstance. Dear friend, wherever you are listening to this today, perhaps you too know something of what Thien carried. Perhaps there is someone in your life whose words have cost you sleep. Perhaps there is an injustice you have had to hold quietly because the louder path would only have made things worse. Perhaps you are tired of being misunderstood by someone who may never choose to understand. The Buddhist teaching is not that we should feel nothing. It is not that we should be passive in the face of wrong. It is something more precise and more demanding than either of those things. It is this: tend your roots. Keep what grows inside you clean. Do not allow what others choose to become what you become. When someone offers you anger, bitterness, or false accusation, remember the teacher's image. You are not required to accept it. If you do not receive it, it remains with the one who brought it. And karma, which is simply the law of cause and effect working patiently through time, does not require.
There is something worth sitting with before we close today. Most of us have been taught, in one way or another, that a life well lived means being acknowledged, that if we are good, people will see it, that if we are right, the world will confirm it, and that fairness, if we are patient enough, will eventually arrive and settle the account. And when it does not come, when we are misread, dismissed, or treated badly by someone who simply moves on without a second thought, we feel the gap between what we expected and what is. That gap is where a great deal of human suffering lives. What Thien understood, slowly, over the course of decades, is that waiting for the outside world to validate the inside life is a kind of trap. Not because fairness does not matter, it does. Not because other people's actions have no consequence, they do. But because making your peace dependent on what others do or acknowledge means giving the keys to your own front door to people who may never knock, may never arrive, may never even know the door exists. The Buddha did not teach detachment in the cold sense, a kind of spiritual indifference that floats above the mess of human life without touching it. He taught something harder and more intimate than that. He taught that we can be fully present in our lives, fully affected by what happens, fully willing to act when action is needed, and still not be swept away. That the center can hold even when the edges are moving. Thien was hurt when Luke accused him. He felt it. When men came to break his fence in the dark and his mother collapsed with fright, he sat on that porch with anger moving through him like a current. He did not pretend otherwise. The practice was not to feel nothing. The practice was to let the feeling exist without immediately becoming the action the feeling was pushing him towards. That is the gap that changes everything. The small, quiet space between what you feel and what you do next. In that space lives the possibility of wisdom. In the Dhammapada, one of the oldest collections of the Buddha's teachings, the very first verse says, "Mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, suffering follows as the wheel follows the hoof of an ox.
If one speaks or acts with a serene mind, happiness follows as a shadow that never departs. This is not a promise that good people will always be treated well. It is something more fundamental, that the quality of your inner life, your actual daily experience of being alive, is shaped far more by what you do with your own mind than by what others do to you. A person consumed by grievance carries it everywhere, into sleep, into meals, into conversations with people who had no dealing with the original wound. The resentment bleeds beyond its original borders until it has colored everything, and the person who created the original cause, who may have forgotten the incident entirely, is completely unaffected. This is what the teacher meant when he told Tien, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. Tien chose differently, not once, but consistently over a lifetime. He chose it when it was hard, when the choice looked like weakness from the outside, when no one was watching or keeping score. And what accumulated over those decades was not a dramatic transformation or a single breakthrough moment. It was something quieter and more durable, a character, a way of being in the world that did not depend on circumstances being favorable to remain intact. This is available to all of us, not as a technique, not as a skill to be acquired and deployed, but as a practice, something returned to again and again each time the wind picks up. The tree does not resist the wind. It does not argue with it. It simply grows downward into the earth where the wind cannot reach. Whatever difficulty you are carrying today, whatever wind is blowing through your life at this moment, may you find the ground beneath you. May you remember that your roots belong to you and that no storm, however loud, can take them as long as you tend them. The path of a good heart is not the easiest path, but it is the one that leads somewhere real. Until we meet again, this is Wandering Lotus Audio. Walk gently.